The Hidden Witness. Chapter 1. The Testimony. Mark Wayland sat at the corner of the dimly lit room, his eyes fixed on the dusty window as if searching for an escape. His heart pounded in his chest, each thud a reminder of the weight he carried. For 10 years, Mark had lived in hiding, his very existence known only to a select few who had helped him vanish. But now, after a decade of silence, the past had found him. A knock on the door echoed through the empty room. Mark froze. It wasn't just any knock, it was the signal. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 more taps. He waited a heartbeat longer before standing, his legs unsteady beneath him. As he opened the door, a man in a dark suit entered. His face was stern, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes scanning the room before settling on Mark. "It's time," the man said, his voice a low whisper. "The trial begins in 2 days." Mark swallowed hard. "Are you sure it's safe?" "I can't. It's not safe, Wayland. It never will be," the man interrupted. "But you're the only witness left. If you don't testify, the case falls apart." Mark turned away, pacing the small room. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing thinner by the second. For years, he'd been able to stay in the shadows, far away from the danger that had once threatened his life. But now, with the trial looming, the fear had returned, sharper than ever. "I thought this was over," Mark muttered, more to himself than to the man. The man's eyes darkened. "It will never be over until he's put away. You know that." Mark flinched at the mention of him. Jonathan Rains, the powerful and corrupt businessman who had orchestrated the murder of a whistleblower all those years ago. Mark had seen everything, but his testimony had come too late. Rains had escaped justice, and Mark had been forced into hiding. "I need you to be in court," the man insisted. "You're the key to locking him up. We've got protection, everything's in place. But you need to trust us." Mark nodded, though his mind screamed otherwise. How could he trust anyone now? Trust had nearly gotten him killed before, and now it felt like he was walking back into the same trap. "What about the others?" Mark asked, his voice hollow. "The ones who testified before?" The man's silence was answer enough. They were all gone, dead or disappeared. Mark knew he was the last piece in the puzzle. Without him, Rains would walk free again. Mark stared at the floor, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. His freedom or his life? There seemed to be no middle ground. The man stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "We've arranged for you to be transported under the highest security. You'll testify and we'll get you out again, safe. But we can't delay any longer." Mark nodded, though dread coiled tightly in his gut. "I'll do it," he whispered. "But if this goes wrong?" "It won't," the man said, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "We won't let it." As the man turned to leave, Mark's gaze drifted back to the window. The world outside felt so close, yet impossibly far. He had been invisible for so long, but now the world would see him again, and with it so would Rains. Will Mark be able to testify without being discovered by his enemies? Subscribe to see how this high-stakes trial unfolds. Chapter 2. The Shadow Returns. 2 days later, Mark sat in the back of a heavily armored SUV, the weight of his decision heavier than the bulletproof glass surrounding him. The city streets passed by in a blur, but all he could focus on was the courthouse that loomed ahead. The building represented justice, but for Mark, it was the gateway to danger. The driver, a large man with a square jaw and a perpetual scowl, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You all right back there?" Mark didn't answer. His hands were trembling slightly, despite the calming pills they'd given him earlier. This was it. The day he had dreaded for 10 years was finally here, testifying against Jonathan Rains, putting his life on the line in front of the world. He glanced down at his phone, where a single message blinked. "Are you ready?" It was from the agent assigned to his protection. the same man who had visited him days before. "As ready as I'll ever be," he typed back, though his stomach churned with unease. The car turned down a narrow alley behind the courthouse, a back entrance, meant to avoid the press and any prying eyes. Security guards in plain clothes were stationed at every corner, their eyes scanning the surroundings, hands hovering near concealed weapons. Mark felt a surge of paranoia. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, every passerby a potential threat. As the car came to a stop, the door swung open, and two agents stepped forward, motioning him out. "Stick close, keep your head down," one of them barked, his tone all business. Mark complied, stepping out into the cool morning air. His breath came shallow, each step toward the building feeling like a walk toward his own execution. The courthouse's stone facade rose before him, cold and indifferent. Inside, the hallways were eerily quiet, a different kind of silence, one that buzzed with tension. The trial was big news, and though they kept Mark's identity secret, he knew that word of his testimony could easily leak. The last thing he needed was for Rains to know he was back in play. The agent from before appeared at his side. "You're going to sit in a private room until you're called. No one knows you're here, not even the jury." "Except Rains," Mark muttered under his breath. The agent didn't respond, but the look on his face said enough. As they reached the room, Mark hesitated before entering. He had never felt more like a target than he did in that moment. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. The room was small, almost suffocating, with no windows, just a single chair and table. He sat down, resting his head in his hands. Time seemed to stretch, each minute an eternity. Outside, he could hear the murmur of voices, distant and indistinct. He tried to steady his breathing, to focus on the moment, but his thoughts kept circling back to one thing: Rains. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, a single, loud knock that shattered the quiet. Mark's heart leaped into his throat. He stood, unsure whether to answer. The door creaked open, revealing one of the agents. His face was pale, eyes wide with alarm. "He knows," the agent whispered. "Rains knows you're here." What will Mark do now that his secret is out? Share and subscribe to find out what happens next. Chapter 3. The Leak. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean he knows?" he asked, his voice trembling. The agent's eyes flickered to the door, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "We're not sure how it happened," the agent replied, his voice low. "But there's chatter. Someone leaked your location. Rain's men are looking for you." Mark's mind raced. He stood, pacing the room, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had known this moment would come. No matter how many precautions were taken, Rain's reach was vast, and his thirst for revenge unrelenting. "What do we do now?" Mark demanded. His voice was more controlled now, but beneath the surface, panic clawed at him. He couldn't run again, not after all this time. The agent squared his shoulders. "We move you. There's a secondary safe house, more secure. We can't risk bringing you into the courthouse now. The trial will have to be delayed." Mark shook his head. "Delayed? Are you insane? That'll give Rains more time to figure out where I am. The longer this drags on, the more dangerous it becomes for me." "I know," the agent said, his tone clipped, "but our options are limited. We can't let you be seen here." Mark slumped against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The past 10 years flashed before him, the countless nights spent in hiding, always looking over his shoulder. He couldn't go back to that, not after coming this close to justice. "Why can't I just testify remotely?" Mark asked, desperate for a solution. The agent shook his head. "The judge won't allow it. He wants you there in person. Your testimony is crucial. He needs the jury to see you, to understand the weight of your words." Mark cursed under his breath. He understood the reasoning, but it didn't make the situation any less terrifying. The thought of standing in front of that courtroom, Rains watching his every move, was almost unbearable. "How long do we have before Rain's men get here?" Mark asked, his voice tight. The agent glanced at his watch, his brow furrowed in concentration. We don't know. Could be minutes, could be hours. We've already increased security around the perimeter, but we can't take any chances. Mark pushed away from the wall and stood tall, a new resolve hardening in his chest. Then let's go. I'm not sticking around to find out. The agent nodded, already pulling out his phone to alert the team. Within seconds, there was a flurry of movement outside the door. Agents assembling, murmuring orders to one another. Mark could feel the urgency in the air, the rising tension as the danger grew closer. Before they could leave, another agent appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Sir, we've got a problem. There's been a security breach at the secondary location. Mark's heart sank. Of course there had been. Rains was always one step ahead, always managing to turn the tide in his favor. What now? Mark asked, his voice laced with frustration. The lead agent didn't hesitate. We have one more option, but it's risky. There's a safe room in the courthouse, hidden from the public. It's not ideal, but it might be our best shot at keeping you safe until we can figure out how to get you out of here. Mark nodded, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. The courthouse, the very place he was trying to avoid, was now his only refuge. Felt like walking into the lion's den, but he had no choice. Let's do it, he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The team mobilized quickly, ushering him down a series of narrow hallways, each one darker and more secluded than the last. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with each step. Mark's pulse quickened as they neared the safe room, the sound of distant footsteps echoing through the halls. When they finally reached the reinforced door, the lead agent turned to him. We'll lock you in. No one can get in or out without this key, he said, holding up a small metal device. You'll be safe here until we come for you. Mark nodded, stepping inside. The room was small, barely enough space for a single person, but it was secure. As the door closed behind him with a heavy thud, Mark sank into the chair, his mind racing. It wasn't long before the lights flickered. Then suddenly, everything went black. Will Mark survive the sudden power outage? Or has Rains already found a way in? Like, subscribe and share to follow the suspense. Chapter 4. The Darkest Hour. The darkness was suffocating. Mark could hear his own breath, shallow and quick, the sound echoing in the confined space. His heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, but even the dim glow of the screen couldn't pierce the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that came with the blackout. Something was wrong, very wrong. He tapped the screen, trying to send a message to the agent outside, but there was no signal. The safe room was designed to block communication signals for security reasons, a precaution that now felt like a trap. Mark cursed under his breath, fighting the rising panic. He was alone, cut off from the world, and vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. His thoughts spun in chaotic circles. Had Rain's men already infiltrated the courthouse? Was this part of their plan? He strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement outside, but the only sound was the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Suddenly, a noise, a faint click, barely audible, but enough to send a jolt of fear through Mark's chest. He froze, every muscle tense, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps. Mark's blood ran cold. They were inside the courthouse. Rain's men had found him. He stood, his back pressed against the wall, eyes darting around the pitch-black room for anything he could use to defend himself. But there was nothing, just him and the dark. Another click. Then, the soft whir of a lock disengaging. The door. It was opening. Is Mark truly trapped? Or will he find a way to escape? Comment and subscribe to stay on the edge of your seat. Chapter 5. The Escape. Mark's pulse surged as the door creaked open. His breath caught in his throat, his body tense and ready to bolt. But where could he go? The room was a dead end. No windows, no exits beyond the one that was now slowly being breached. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, faint but unmistakable. Mark squinted in the darkness, his mind racing. Could it be one of the agents? Or worse, one of Rain's men? Mark! A voice whispered, soft but urgent. It was familiar. Mark exhaled in relief. It was the lead agent. "We've got to move. Now." The agent hissed. He stepped into the room, pulling Mark toward the door. "The power outage isn't an accident. We've been compromised." Mark didn't need to be told twice. He followed the agent out into the dark hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. The courthouse felt like a labyrinth in the blackness, every corner an opportunity for an ambush. They moved swiftly, the agent leading the way with confident strides despite the lack of light. "How did they find me?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible as they hurried through the narrow corridors. The agent shook his head. "We're still figuring that out, but it's clear someone inside leaked your location. We've locked down the exits, but we need to get you out before Rain's people make a move." They rounded a corner, and Mark's foot caught on something, nearly sending him sprawling. He glanced down, a body, one of the security guards lying face down, unmoving. Mark's stomach lurched. Whoever was after him was already here inside the courthouse. "They're getting closer," Mark muttered. The agent didn't respond, only quickened the pace, leading Mark down another set of stairs. The air grew cooler as they descended deeper into the building. Mark's nerves were on edge, every sound amplified in the silence. Finally, they reached a heavy metal door at the end of a long hallway. The agent swiped a keycard through a small reader, and the door unlocked with a soft beep. "Through here," the agent said, motioning for Mark to enter. Mark hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, a primal instinct warning him that danger was near. He turned to the agent, his eyes narrowing. "Wait, how do I know I can trust you?" Mark asked, his voice low but sharp. The agent's expression darkened, just for a second, but it was enough. Mark saw the flicker of guilt, the hesitation. His heart sank. "You're working for Rains," Mark whispered, his blood turning to ice. The agent's hand moved quickly to his waistband, where a concealed gun rested. But Mark was faster. Fueled by adrenaline, he lunged forward, knocking the agent's arm aside. The gun clattered to the floor as they struggled, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. Mark wrestled the agent to the ground, his breath ragged as he pinned him down. "Why?" Mark demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "Why betray me?" The agent grunted, his face twisted in pain. "Money. Rains offered me more than I could ever dream of. It's nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" Mark spat. His hands tightened around the agent's collar. "You've just signed my death warrant." The agent chuckled darkly. "You were dead the moment you agreed to testify, Mark. This was always how it was going to end." Mark stared down at him, the weight of the words sinking in. He had been a pawn in a game much larger than he'd realized. No matter how hard he'd tried to escape, Rains had always been one step ahead, pulling the strings. Sirens wailed in the distance, a faint sound growing louder. Reinforcements. Mark released the agent and stumbled back, his mind spinning. He had no time to think, no time to regret. He grabbed the gun from the floor and bolted down the hallway, the sound of approaching footsteps echoing behind him. His only thought now was survival. How will Mark survive with betrayal closing in on all sides? Like, subscribe, and comment to see what happens next. Chapter 6. The Final Confrontation. Mark ran, the cold metal of the gun heavy in his hand. His breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as he sprinted through the darkened hallways of the courthouse. Every step he took felt like a countdown, each second closer to his inevitable confrontation with Rain's men. He reached the main hallway, where dim emergency lights flickered ominously. The courthouse was eerily empty, the usual bustling crowd of lawyers and clerks nowhere to be seen. It felt like a ghost town, the silence suffocating. As Mark turned a corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing at the far end of the hallway, was Jonathan Rains. The man was just as Mark remembered, tall, imposing, with a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to pierce through the shadows. Behind him stood two of his henchmen, their expressions hard, weapons drawn. Mark's heart raced. He hadn't expected Rains to be here, not in person. But seeing him now, standing in the flesh, brought a rush of anger and fear to the surface. "It's over, Waylon," Rains said, his voice smooth and confident. "You should have stayed in hiding. Now you've left me no choice." Mark raised the gun, his hand shaking. "You're going to pay for what you've done, Rains. This time you won't get away." Rains chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "You think a bullet will stop me? You think your testimony will bring me down? You're just another loose end I need to tie up." Mark's grip tightened on the gun. He knew Rains was right. Even if he shot him now, there would be others. Others just as corrupt, just as dangerous. The system was rigged, and Mark was a lone man standing against a machine much larger than himself. But he couldn't back down. "Not now. I'm not afraid of you anymore," Mark said, his voice steady. "You've taken everything from me, but you won't take my life." Rains' expression hardened, and he nodded to his men. "Do it." The two henchmen stepped forward, raising their weapons. Time seemed to slow as Mark raised the gun and fired. The sound of gunfire echoed through the empty halls, a sharp, deafening crack that reverberated in his skull. One of the henchmen dropped to the floor, clutching his chest. The other hesitated, just long enough for Mark to dive behind a nearby column, his heart pounding in his ears. He fired again, missing by inches as the second henchman returned fire, bullets ricocheting off the marble walls. Rains stood back, watching the chaos unfold with a calm detachment. To him, this was just another business transaction, another problem to be solved. Mark's breath came in ragged bursts as he crouched behind the column, his mind racing. He was running out of options. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and quickly running out of time. But he wasn't out of courage. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Mark leaped from his cover, firing a final shot. The second henchman fell, his gun skittering across the floor. Now it was just Mark and Rains. The two men stood facing each other, the tension thick between them. Rains smirked, unfazed by the carnage around him. "You're a fool, Waylon. You always were." Mark raised the gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Maybe," he said, "but at least I can still do the right thing." He pulled the trigger. Rains staggered back, a look of shock crossing his face. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable, human. He collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Mark lowered the gun, his hands trembling. The sound of sirens grew louder, closer, but for the first time in a decade, Mark felt a sense of peace. It was over. The nightmare had finally ended. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.